Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you after such a long hiatus. I think it's been 4 days now, which is a record. Really. We're going to be having quite a weighty agenda today. But before we start, I'd like to have April call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Saslaw.
Here.
Senator Normant.
Here.
Senator Hanger.
Here.
Senator Lucas. Senator Newman.
Here.
Senator Ruff.
Here.
Senator Vogel. Here. Senator Barker.
Here.
Senator Edwards.
Here.
Senator Deeds.
Here.
Senator Locke.
Here.
Senator Peterson.
Here.
Senator Marsden.
Here.
Senator Eben.
Here.
Senator McClellan.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I discuss the agenda, I'd like to go through some of the ground rules, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with by now. Please mute your phone when you're not speaking. Introduce or announce yourself if you're asking a question or speaking. And remember that this meeting is being recorded and it may be possible for the public and or the members to see you. If you're not using the video link, you may turn your camera off if you need to step away. Now turning to the agenda. We have been apart only 4 days, but we are continuing to work. And we need to look forward to the next session. First, today, we'll get our usual update from the Secretary of Finance, Aubrey Lane, on the September revenues. This will be followed by Kevin Hall, and he will provide an update on the lottery forecast and look at the new expanded gaming that's going on. And we'll conclude with a presentation by Peter Blake from Chev on higher education fall enrollment and operational impacts related to the ongoing pandemic. So with that, I'll now turn it over to Secretary Lane. Thank you for being here, Aubrey.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Let me first congratulate everybody on our budget. We'll look forward to working with you to bring that to fruition here in the next couple weeks or so. What I thought I would do today, I heard your comments, Madam Chair, regarding looking forward, and that's what I'm going to try to do a little bit as we go through these numbers here. So next page, please. You should have all received my report that I send to you as Money Chair committee members, but also the rating agencies. And it's very clear we had a very solid and I would say extraordinary month of September and third quarter. So with that, I'll go through, get right into it. Now let's go to the next page, please. As you recall, our fourth quarter of last year, just like in the nation, we were coming off one of the largest decreases in economic activity since the Great Depression, over 31% down. The good news is, in this recent quarter, our first quarter of our new fiscal year, we got a lot of that back. It was an equally impressive V-shaped recovery in the third quarter of the calendar year and our first quarter. Now, we did see some things that started to slow a little bit. Job growth across the nation slowed in September, and payroll employment growth slowed down. I think a lot of that had to do with the initial opening back up to the economy and then adjusting to the new economic reality that we have in dealing with COVID-19. I'll also pointing out at the bottom of the page, the Institute of Supply Management fell, and I tend to look at that as a more forward-looking index. It had been going up quite nicely the last few months, and it fell slightly. So I think a lot of that had to do with sort of the tail off, or at least the break in the economic recovery. Next page, please. If you look at the things that I think help underpin this recovery in the third quarter, I would point to the second bullet here. The Federal Reserve left interest rates and will continue to leave them at next to zero for the foreseeable future. And when you combine that with the fiscal stimulus, the over $2.5 trillion of fiscal stimulus that was put in by the federal authorities. In fact, you recall the last time we spoke, that fiscal stimulus exceeded the amount of the reduction in payroll that had occurred because of the COVID-19 impacts to our economy. And again, that I think was a major factor in helping us in the third quarter. As you know, as of today, there is no indication that we'll have additional stimulus, at least not until after the election. The other thing that I would point out here, if you go to the fourth bullet, the reason I said this was an extraordinary quarter, back in March, if you would have told me that our unemployment rate would be double what it was last year, but our total revenues would be up 10% for the current fiscal year, and our withholding would be up, our payroll tax withholding would be up 2.4%. I think many of you would have told me that I was being very overly optimistic. So the question will be, as we go forward, what is underpinning this, and can it be sustainable? And obviously, we hope that that is the case. Next page. I think this graph really gives us a good picture of what the quarter was about. And as you can see, we are running up 9.9% ahead of our annual forecast, and September was a good month. But if you look at this, you can see the substantial amount of the excess that we're running over our revised forecast occurred in July. And of course, that had a lot to do with the non-withholding and the final payment of income taxes that related to the previous fiscal year. One other thing I would point out here is, and we'll get into this when we get to the withholding, we did have one additional deposit day, which is worth about $120 million. That would have normally been received in October, but the way the Tuesdays and Wednesdays fell with the calendar, it occurred in this year. But nonetheless, I don't want to underestimate, it was a very solid month and a very solid quarter for the Commonwealth. And I would say we're an anomaly. I have had a chance to talk with our rating agencies and Bloomberg News and others, and unlike many of our sister states, we are faring fairly well with this. And I'll get into that a little bit as we get further into the presentation. Next page, please. As you can see here, we had a very good month in September for withholding, and a lot of that had to do with the additional deposit day. We were up 11.4% for the month, which puts us right on the annual growth anticipated with the revised forecast, 2.4% growth. Had the additional day fell in the succeeding month in October, we would have been about flat. But still, even that is a very good showing based on the increased unemployment that we have in the Commonwealth. And again, it gets back to, I haven't provided any graphs this time, but as you recall, our large employers that pay us over 50% of our withholding continue to do well. And they have continued to grow and add employees during this quarter. Now, anecdotally, we are seeing, if you look at any of the newspapers or our business journals, that business is now starting to understand this is no longer going to be a sprint, but a marathon. And we're starting to see, but I'll use the airlines and others, looking at the demand and beginning to right size a little bit. So we'll see how that plays out going forward. But so far, because of our reliance on defense contracting and our tech business here in the Commonwealth, our federal employees that we have represented in our payroll, we've held up very, very well. Next page. Non-withholding tax collections, again, were good in the month of September. And this is one item I would point out. I do believe that this may represent a new reality for us going forward. As you recall, if you look back in July, a lot of that money, about $325 million of the overage we're seeing here, does relate to the previous year payment of income taxes. And I'm not just guessing at that. We had the tax department, Greg Burns and his team went back and actually matched the payments to the return and the year for which the return was being paid. So we know about $325 million related to this overage, which is the substantial part of the excess revenues we have so far today, related to the previous year. And as you recall, that was because the July 15th became the new tax deadline for the federal authorities. And even though we didn't change ours past June 1st, many people still paid Virginia along with their federal return. However, that still leaves a little over $40 million in additional revenues for this year over last year. And I think that may have to do a lot with the new gig economy and the impacts of this virus. Up until now, it's been the large employers that have been holding up. But Virginia business, as well as the national business, is very resilient. And many people are finding ways to reinvent themselves in this new economy. And many of those are not having a paycheck so more. They're not an employee, but they're doing it through their own self-employment. And of course, that would show up in non-withholding because they don't have a payroll tax to pay from an employer. And this would be paid in quarterly increments. And I would suggest a little bit of that is going on here. Next page. But of course, this is a very volatile revenue source. And I include this page because it has not been the history of the Commonwealth, once it has a very large non-withholding year, that it continues to repeat itself. And of course, we were worried about this last year because of our experience with the expiration of the Bush tax cuts in 13 and 14. But that did not occur this past year. We had a very, very significant non-withholding on top of the previous year. So I do believe this could be somewhat of a new trend. It's still the jury's out for us as to how this will play out. As you know, the fourth quarter is where we receive most of these payments. But nonetheless, it appears that with the stock market and this expanding clientele of people reinventing themselves and working for themselves, it may put more in non-withholding than we've traditionally seen. Next page, please. And in fact, this graph just points out, though, the problem with that is it all comes in the fourth quarter. Over 50% of this revenue source, the most volatile source of ours, comes in our fourth quarter, which means that is next April, May, and June. So while we may be experiencing this, we really won't know if this is going to come to fruition totally for the year until we get into the fourth quarter, almost 8 months from now to see, or 6 months from now when we begin it, to determine whether or not this trend that we think is happening will continue. So next slide, please. But in addition, the other part to individual income taxes is refunds, and we've also seen those up this year. In fact, about 110 million again was due to the previous year for tax returns filed. We would have normally done those in the previous year. So when you net the 325 that we know we had paid versus the 110, we have about $280 million that really in this year relates to the previous year. And I bring this up because when we do our reforecast, we're going to show those numbers in the previous year for reforecasting, because that's the only way we're going to get the real trend. If we were to put them in this year, we would necessarily not have a good forecast for the coming year. But even with that, I think we can all be very well pleased that from payroll, withholding, non-withholding, and refunds, individual income tax held up very well for the quarter. And I do believe a lot of that has to do with not only the changes in the economy, but our large employers holding up very well during this pandemic. Next page, please. Now, sales tax collections, again, have held up, and we're running ahead of last year. But again, I will point to a lot of this had to do with the receipts in the first quarter. Now, why is that? Because a year ago, the General Assembly approved and the governor signed into law the Wayfair legislation, which allowed taxing of internet sales. That began July 1st of 2019. So July of last year, we were not going against those collections because they're 30 days in arrears. So for the first month, we had sort of apples and oranges in comparing internet sales collections for taxes, for sales and use tax that we didn't have a year before. The last 2 months are a little better indication. We were collecting those taxes, those two in August and September, and you can see our trend dropped off significantly in going up to the previous year because we were getting apples and apples and collecting those taxes. Now, however, there was some additional monies given back for accelerated sales tax. As you recall, in June of this year, those large employers had to pay based on the previous year or their estimate. Many of those did not reach those sales, and there were some refunds that were given back into September. But overall, this has held up pretty well. The consumer has continued to spend, but I will point out that most of this has come with the move to internet retailing. We are capturing that, but our budget from here out will be going up against last year's numbers that also have those numbers in there. So just want to point out here, while it's been a good quarter, a majority of that had to do with the first month collections in July, that we were not going up against the previous year collections for internet taxes. I've seen anecdotal information. I got a question on this last time, what the Christmas season looks like. Most people are calling flat to last year is what they're anticipating. Hopefully we'll do better than that, but that's the only read I have right now as to where we may be headed. Okay, next slide. Corporate income tax collections have remained strong. Again, I believe that deals with the federal contractors in our defense spending in our budget, along with those individuals, those large companies. But we do know here about $35 million of this also relates to the previous year. We matched it to returns. So we're still up. This is a very volatile source. You can't really look at a quarter. It depends on the income from these individual companies as we go through. But nonetheless, we still had a very good quarter, although some of that relates to the previous year. So when you net all that together, it's about $250 million of the excess revenues that we're showing this year relate to the previous year. About half of it, of our overage through the first 3 months relate to the previous year. Next page, please. One of those things that is going to relate to this year and it continue to go is our recordation taxes. You can see we were still up over 50%. That has to do with low interest rates and the booming home improvement market, but also the selling market for homes. That has remained very strong. And of course, refinances. The last report I saw, there was still 90 to 120 days of unmet demand or supply in the chain to be refinanced. So I expect this revenue source to continue to be a positive as we go through at least the next 4 or 5 months in there. In terms of insurance, really nothing to report here. We have not seen significant rebates. At least so far, remember insurance companies were giving holidays to those individuals who didn't drive or you couldn't go to the doctor or what have you for insurance, but that has not been significant so far. We'll see how that goes. But of course, as you know, the first $181.4 million goes to the Transportation Trust Fund, so we have not reached that amount to impact our general fund yet. So next page, please. What this all means is that we are running significantly ahead of last year. In fact, we're $570 million ahead of our forecast, ahead of our interim forecast, which obviously thought we would be down about 1.8%. We're up almost 10%. So through the first 3 months, we're $570 million ahead of the forecast. And of course, about half of that, as I've mentioned, I believe relates to the previous year, but the other relates to the current year. And the question will be whether or not that will be sustainable going forward as we move into the new reforecast that'll be coming up. Next page. Now, also, this will be the last time I show this slide because you have passed a budget that has adopted the new interim forecast. This is how we were doing to the old forecast that you adopted back in March and April of this past year, or the old budget. And you can see we're running ahead of that forecast also. It primarily relates to the monies that we received related to the prior year, the $268 million. But the bottom line is, through the first quarter, we are making the original forecast that we anticipated back in last March. And I would suggest to you that if anybody would have thought that would have been the case, again, you would have told me I would be overly optimistic in where we've been. So that sort of ends up where the general fund is. On a quarterly basis, I'd like to also show you with the next slide where we are with transportation revenues. We are down slightly in the motor fuel taxes, but some of that has to do with the reporting lag. It has rebounded, but not as quickly and not as strongly as the general fund revenues. One thing here, we do see that motor vehicle sales have started to come back. Remember, they were off a couple months ago. They're starting to come back. So hopefully the consumer will continue to spend. Right now, though, we are running ahead of the forecast, but we do anticipate that to slow based on the motor fuel taxes that we received. We have not seen a return in driving habits and other things that we have seen in the consumer spending in the general fund. So that's where transportation stands. Now, this all leads us to the next page, please, where we will get into the new revenue forecasting schedule in preparation for the new budget that we're working on right now, that we'll be entertaining. The governor will present on December 16th. We've already started working on this forecast. Of course, the last data point will be the final October sales and revenues that we have for October in the general fund. But on November 4th, we'll meet with our Joint Advisory Board of Economists, and of course, your staff is part of that meeting as we go through this. This will be also the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates, where many of you members are part of, and businesses across the Commonwealth will come back in, and we'll weigh on this for the Governor to present on December the 16th, along with his budget. The key will be here is I don't think there's any doubt that there has been stronger revenues in the first quarter than anticipated. How much of that will be sustainable, and looking at the economic impacts that we have. Which leads me to the next slide, please. And talking a little bit about the budget, some risk and considerations that I think we should keep in mind as we move forward. We've always said here that to fix the real economy and really to stabilize our budget, we need to deal with the health crisis. And of course, the question with that is on everybody's mind is, when is that going to end? I happened to hear a presentation last night from Dr. Richard Wenzel, who is at VCU in infectious diseases, and also from Danny Avula, Dr. Avula from our Department of Health. And for the first time, I put together some metrics as to when we might think this will allow to what is called normal. Now, I'm not sure the normal after this is going to be like the normal before this, and we'll get into that. But if you look at the key for us getting back to a normal lifestyle, whatever that may be, it's going to come down to the immunity in our population, whether you call that herd immunity or anything else. But it's going to come down to our ability to have this disease work through the population. To get to that, we need 70% prevalence. In other words, to return to normalcy, we need about 70% prevalence. Dr. Avula mentioned last night that where we are today, he thinks we're between 5 and 6% here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If you look at that, now, the way to get this immunity is two things. Either the virus works its way through or we get a vaccine. Of course, right now, we don't have a vaccine, so we only have the experience that we've had so far with the virus. If you interpolate over the last 8 months that we've incurred 6% immunity, our population, we've had 168,000 cases and a little almost 3,500 deaths to get there. If you interpolate that same amount of working its way through with the protections we're taking every 8 months, it would take us 6 years to get to 70% immunity. And that would also include, if you interpolate it, almost 1 million more cases and 20,000 more deaths. Obviously, that's why a vaccine is so important to get to, for us to return to, especially those businesses that have crowds and relate to public being inside. Now, the vaccine is dependent on two things: the effectiveness of the vaccine and the amount of people, percentage in our population, that will take it. And if you look at the history of vaccines, a good one would be if we were 75% effective and 50% of the population took it. If that's the case, that would give us an additional 37.5% immunity. To get to 63%, that is, to end this by the end of next year, we would need a vaccine that's 90% effective and at least 70% of the population would take it. So the bottom line to this is, the best case for us, we're going to be in this through the end of 21. Because if you listen to the national level, when there will be a vaccine available for widespread use, it'll be about a year from now. And therefore, we're going to be dealing with, on the best case, through the end of 2021, and potentially further than that, depending on the effectiveness and the amount of people that take the vaccine. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we look at our budget considerations going forward. And we now know it's going to be more of a marathon than a sprint. And I don't believe we're going to go back to exactly the way we were before. And nor do I think we should. Because if you think about our economy the way it was before, I don't think any of us want to get to the income inequality that we experienced that has been going on. So I think as we look forward, we should keep those considerations informed. And here's a few things that I would suggest that we consider. First of all, on COVID-19, I cannot overestimate how much the federal fiscal and monetary policy helped to underpin our economy. Right now, we don't see that coming. And of course, it's come at a cost. As it was reported in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, our federal debt is now 102% of our gross domestic product. We are now joining the likes of Greece, Italy, and Japan as the amount of debt we have in this country. But the bottom line is that underpinned our economic activity the last 4 or 5 months. And we need to consider that as we move forward with our budget. The other thing is our right sizing in the private business. We have what's going on here, and I alluded to it earlier, entrepreneurship in the small business that's rebounding, but many of the other large businesses are restructuring their workforce because of the trends, and that is resulting in layoffs and many jobs that just won't come back because they are now found to, as we work through this, their demand has waned some. And of course, we have the long-term trends we need to consider. We had a problem with international trade before this all started. Low interest rates are going to be with us for a long time. That's going to affect real estate and other asset prices. Certainly teleworking and commuting are going to be with us. And so these are all things we need to consider. And I'll leave you with this on structural balance. If you look at our balance sheet and if you look at our 2-year budget, on paper, we have a structural balance problem in the second year. And the reason I say on paper, because I'm not convinced that it's going to be, we're going to actually have one. And that all gets back to our revenues in that. Now, structural balance, as you all recall, is what got us in problem with the rating agencies the last time we were put on watch. And it's simply using one-time monies to do ongoing expenditures. And of course, during a pandemic, we want to continue our ongoing base budget, which is one of the priorities that the governor has been. We have not had significant layoffs. We have not cut areas, but we have had to limit our spending. Now, there are some trends that may go the other way to help us. I mentioned non-withholding. If truly we're in a new trend, that's going to increase our revenues, and that may offset some of the structural balance in the second year or imbalance that we show on paper. And right now have $570 million of excess revenues. Some of those are going to be continuing. So that certainly could help us as we go forward. new revenues. And I don't know everybody wants to talk about taxes or fees, but you as a General Assembly are appropriators, and there may be the opportunity for new revenues, particularly as we view it in light of what the old economy was and how our citizens were impacted across all socio and economic scales. And of course, we also have the ability to reduce expenditures. Some of those are mandatory, and we know in Medicaid, it looks like we may not have to deal with those increases this year because of the impacts of COVID in the previous year. That hasn't been announced, but we may not have those drivers that we've seen in the past that continue spending. They may give us a break this year. So I point this out that I want you to consider, I believe we all should consider structural balance and imbalance, but it's not something that's a given. We can deal with this, and I just think we need to keep it on our plate as we go forward. And also considering the fact that if the impacts of COVID-19 and the response from Washington are really going to underpin some of the economic activity here in the Commonwealth. Okay, let me finish up here, Madam Chair. I'll go to the CARES Act funding. I want to give you guys, next slide, give you an update of where we are. Let me just point out a couple of things to make sure we're all on the same wavelength. We all have been saying, yes, we have to spend these monies by December the 31st. But what we actually have to do is incur the allowed expenditure by December 31st. The guidelines have been updated to allow us to pay the actual cash payment after that. Whether that's 30 days or 90 days is still up to interpretation, because it says it's going to be in compliance with federal guidelines with other grants. At the minimum, we'll have 30 days and maybe longer than that. So I want to point that out. We do want to be expeditious and move forward quickly with these, but we also want to make sure we get it right. And as long as we are incurring that expenditure by the 31st, we still can reimburse it with these monies after that date. For at least 30 days. The page you have in front of you is an update of the monies that have actually been appropriated and allocated to specific purposes across the Commonwealth. Of course, you know, we started with about $3.1 billion of monies that came directly to us. The largest portion of that went to local governments. And then you can see here the other items that have been allocated. The ones at the bottom are relatively new, that have come out in the last couple of weeks that, when I say new, we've been working on, but with you and your staffs, but the governor has just announced. And so as you look here today, we are about a little under $1 billion left to be obligated going through. Now, if you look at the next page, please. These are all the requests, and of course, this includes the direction that we've received from you from the budget, and all candor. A lot of these we were working together with you on, so we have the shared obligation to get these out. These are all the requests, and of course, this is fluid. Many of these are in the process of being done and will be announced quickly. But as you can see, we do have more requests than we do have ability to fund. And as we work through these, I do know, for instance, that child care recovery was something that was signed this morning. That's $58 million you see on here. So this is very fluid and will continue to come out over the next few weeks as the governor and we work through the actual expenditure for these monies. And I would also point out that over and above your desire to get this out, we are making sure that the agencies can actually execute this. And that's what some of the time you'll see the numbers change a little bit differently than what you suggested as we get the policy that you've initiated, but actually equated to the expenditure needed to meet that policy. For example, I'll bring your attention to the labor hazard pay we just did. It ended up being almost $72 million to get $1,500 per employee during that period. So I wanted to assure you that we are working on your list, working through with you, with your team, and we anticipate getting all this money out the door. Of course, you directed that if there were any monies left over to go to the unemployment insurance, and I'm pretty comfortable there is we'll be able to meet all those obligations and also do something in that regard. So, Madam Chair, that's an update of the stimulus funding. It's an update where we are on the budget. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any from you, Madam Chair, or the members.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That was very thorough and, as often is the case, thought-provoking when you speak. It's pretty obvious to me that we're simultaneously in the best of times and the worst of times when it comes to our budget, and that the uncertainties are sobering. And I also appreciate your mentioning that we will probably need to be looking at our tax policies going forward to make sure that they meet the new realities that we're going to be facing. Are there any questions from any member?
Yeah. Janet?
Senator Sassel.
Yeah, Aubrey, you presented a pretty good picture. Last spring, we were estimating having to cut $2.7 billion out of the general fund for the biennium. When all is said and done now, what do you project we'll have to cut for 2021 FY, the remainder of it, and FY 2022?
Well, your last budget, Senator Sasselaw, Madam Chair, did recognize this $2.7 billion reduction. You did unallot some items in that for new spending. Where we stand right now, 62% of our budget is payroll withholding. We are dead on that new projection where we would be down $2.7 billion. We're right at 2.4% growth as to what that projection called for. So assuming we don't have any waning in that, then that's good news for us. Now, where we are running ahead so far is sales taxes. The question will be, a lot of that had to do with the first month, whether that will continue. And of course, non-withholding is still running ahead, but we won't know that till the fourth quarter. So, Senator Sasselaw, I can't put a specific number. I would say it's probably going to be a little better. Recordation taxes, I do think, are going to keep up. I don't think it's going to be a magnitude of many times hundreds of millions, but I do expect to see a little better picture going forward. And again, it really gets back to when a lot of the adjustments our businesses are making regarding, for instance, small business. So they've been hit very, very hard. They are not showing they're coming back. Many of those are having to go find other things. But Senator, I do expect to see some movement, some positive movement in revenue generation on this forecast. I don't want to hazard a guess at what magnitude it would be. I do think we may not have the deficit we've had in previous years in Medicaid, for instance, and you recognize some of that in your recent budget. You took some of that savings and to offset some other expenditures. So we'll know more in the next month or so. I would say right now we were a little conservative, and I would expect some movement positive, but I don't want to give a magnitude as I simply just don't know, Senator.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Senator Peterson.
Aubrey, first of all, fantastic presentation as always. A couple comments / questions from my perspective. One, it seems as if a lot of our sales tax revenue at this point has shifted from traditional bricks and mortar to online. And if we're going to have restrictions, whether it's wearing masks, whether it's going to be the number of people at retail businesses going forward, we've tilted the playing field pretty dramatically in favor of the online platforms. And I guess my first question / comment would be, is there any thought to adjusting fiscal policy to the impact that we've shifted the playing field and tilted it in favor of the online retailers? That's number one. Number two is, you talked and mentioned basically if we wait for herd immunity, it's going to take 6 years if we don't get a vaccine. And 6 years is a long time. And I have 4 children who are in school right now. What are we doing to open up the schools? We're not going to have a 6-year shutdown of the schools. I can tell you that. So, from a fiscal point of view, what can we do to get schools open so we're not facing a 6-year shutdown?
Well, first, let me take the online retailers. I would say that the Wayfair legislation, Senator Peterson, really leveled the playing field with traditional retailers, but the COVID-19 has really made it now an unlevel because of those businesses not being able to be open and have the amount of people in their stores in that regard. This is a trend that was going on before this, as you recall, just like telework, it was a trend, but this COVID-19 and the shutdown has exacerbated it going forward. So I have not been involved in any discussions on policy changes. I understand your point there, but this may be sort of leading to your second point too. We may have to look at a whole way of doing things going forward. And that's why I said, when we go back to normal, I'm not sure normal is going to be exactly the way it was before. Now, let me go over to the schools, and certainly my estimates assume that the first 8 months were indicative of where we were going to be the next 8 months. And that's obviously going to be changed because we have learned to deal with this disease and to live with it in that. And we now know events outside don't have nearly the impact that events inside do. I was at a restaurant the other night and they had all the windows open. And so they were able to overcome some of that. Of course, many of them have put up tents and different things. So I don't mean to assume that I have the answer that's going to be a total 6 years. I was just trying to point out, though, without a vaccine, it's probably a matter of years and not months going forward. In terms of the schools, I know that is something that Secretary Carney and others are working on, Senator Peterson. We just gave an additional $220 million working with the General Assembly to help them provide PPE and other things to get them open. But I'll be the first to admit, Senator, I do not have the policy changes other than I know we're going to need to keep that in consideration of what's going to needed to get us not only an in-person instruction, but getting some of our businesses back on their feet. I don't have the answers, but I do know it's not going to be exactly the way it was before we went into this.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else with a question?
Madam Chairman, this is Steve.
Senator Newman.
Yeah, two quick items, Aubrey. Thank you, as always, for everything you're providing to us. One, I don't know how you model it, but I know that there's just a lot of companies out there that while they spent their PPP money as Congress required, they're also mirroring that money and keeping it in separate accounts because they don't know what Congress is going to do on the rules. And so it's just a lot of fear on how you actually book that money. And I guess, I don't know if there's any way to start to model that, but that's going to probably be a potential positive to our budget. The other is if the polls are correct and we have a Biden administration, I guess it's going to be pretty incumbent upon us to look and see what the next Congress is going to do with the quote unquote tax cut by Trump, because that I think could leave us over $1 billion. I mean, we're doing great, and congratulations to the work you're doing and the chair and others. But it just seems to me that's something that when Gaker gets together and pretty quick, we're going to have to realize, is that something that's going to happen quick in the new Congress? And if so, we've got to make some adjustments to it, sir.
Yes, Senator Newman, Madam Chair, both good points. Certainly on the PPP loans, I know a lot of people have failed to take them into income because they're not sure exactly what the rules will be. That is some of the issues that we've been dealing with getting out the money here at the state because they continue to change. And I would say that we have tried to be aggressive, but not in violation of the rules and moving that out, just like a lot of companies I think are. But those that can bank that money, I know have, and that could be a positive going forward. You're right. I've looked at the Biden tax policy going forward. I think it would shift it. The question would be, how that impacts many Virginians, because Senator Newman, you were involved in these talks, as you know, those higher income people, we chose not to in the state, we chose not to conform to that legislation. So they may be impacted more so than that. On the other hand, there could be others that would have less taxes. So I think that's a very good point looking at that. And of course, by the time we get into this, I say this, assuming we get any normal result from the election and we know the answer, we'll know sort of what the new administration would be. But, you make a great point, Senator Newman. Businesses are going to change much more quickly than government does. I was in a discussion last night. They're already looking at what this new normal is going to look like, and they're going to look to us to help some of these policy issues going forward as they have to adjust. And whether it's in-school instruction or more people in the restaurants, or how we're going to deal with some of these other restrictions, I think they're going to be looking to us. We're a Dillon Rule state, and a lot of that runs right through the General Assembly and the governor's office. So I will keep both of these points in mind as we go through the reforecast. Thank you, sir.
Madam Chair.
Senator Marsden.
Thank you, ma'am. Aubrey, what has been the impact of COVID on our non-general fund agencies and their ability to sustain themselves during this pandemic? Do you have a sense of how that's going?
Yes, sir. A little bit, Senator Marsden, Madam Chair. I did go through transportation. They installed that impact here. They are anticipated to be down about $800 million over the next the biennium in terms of the revenues. Of course, you pass legislation in the budget when I expect the government to sign that allows them to move some monies around so it won't slow projects down. But that's a topic, particularly with transit. When is that going to return to normal? People are going to feel safe being in crowded cars or rail trains or different things. So I think that's one thing we need to take into account. You're going to have a report here in a few minutes from the lottery. I think you're going to find that's a very positive report that has come up. You've seen ABC profits. That has been, you took some of their additional revenue into the budget. So that has been a positive going for them. We look at the Port of Virginia. It had been running off, but just had a significant import month this past month. So it looks like they've been impacted, Senator, but just like us, they are figuring out the new normal and what underpinned a lot of that. And there's going to be winners and losers as we go through this. There was a great article in the just previous Economist that listed out and talked about all these things, that the trends that are coming about. But in general, I would say for the most part, our non-general fund agencies have adapted like we have, and many have been pleasantly surprised. Particularly, I mentioned ABC and the lottery. I think the lottery had to do a lot with the gaming not being what it was before, the gray machines, which we're going to use those monies going forward for K through 12, and they're adapting to this. So my biggest drag will be in the transportation, particularly transit, how that's going to respond until we get a vaccine.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Adam Eben here. Madam Chair.
Senator Eben.
Yeah, Secretary Lane, is there any doubt at all that we'll be able to spend all the CARES money in time to meet that deadline?
Senator Eben, Madam Chair, no, sir, no doubt in my mind. One of the things that you directed would be if there were any monies left, that they would go to the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund deficit. That's anticipated to be over $650 million. So that we'll be incurring all that before December 31st. So I'm very comfortable that it will be a fail-safe for us. Number two, as I mentioned before, Senator Eben, we do have some time to look after December 30th, whether it's 30 days or longer than that, for expenditures that may not have made this list that we can reimburse ourselves for that would qualify. So I'm very comfortable that we will not be in a position where we're returning monies. The question will be, can we get them out to the programs we want, prioritize based on the General Assembly's wishes and making sure the agencies can execute those. But I'm comfortable that we will utilize all these monies.
Thank you.
Any other question? Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. We always benefit from your thoughts and your wisdom And I think today's discussion was particularly enlightening and helpful to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to working with you and the committee members on this budget and the next one coming up soon.
Yes, they just keep coming.
Thank you.
Okay, next we're going to be hearing from Kevin Hall from the Virginia Lottery. Welcome, Kevin.
Madam Chair, thank you, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to present. Before we talk about the lottery's financial performance, I'd like to do just a brief recap on the impacts on our business operations due to the public health emergency. On March 20th, after the governor declared the emergency and public health officials encouraged telework, we basically closed our Richmond headquarters and sent our 300 employees home with laptops and with secure access to our business networks. We suspended product advertising. We pulled our sales team from the field. We looked for every opportunity to celebrate our teachers. I think you would agree teachers stepped up in some pretty heroic ways during a very challenging time last spring. And to highlight the lottery's role in providing support for K-12 schools. We have continued since March to operate at almost 100% remote work. We're using video meeting platforms just like this one. And at the lottery, it's actually worked a lot better than many of us expected. We've figured out new ways to interact safely with customers. We extended the time period to claim a prize. We closed our prize claim centers for about 8 weeks, and customers submitted winning tickets the old-fashioned way, by mail. In mid-May, we successfully reopened the 8 regional customer centers after completely redesigning the space and implementing new safety protocols that protected both customers and employees. We conduct lottery drawings twice a day, 7 days a week, and we haven't missed a single draw. We've continued to work on new products, new product delivery systems. At the same time, we've made substantial progress in building out the new regulatory infrastructure that's required around expanded gaming, and I'll get into that in some detail in a moment. We've continued to work really closely and effectively with our retail partners. Retailers obviously control what goes on inside their stores, and we've extended maximum flexibility to them and a bit of grace as they've tried to navigate the extraordinary time since March. Our field team now is kind of easing back into once a month in-store visits as opposed to the once a week sales calls that were routine before the pandemic. So I'm pleased to report that we've continued to operate the business efficiently, safely, and successfully while working to keep our employees, our customers, our retail partners, and their families as safe as possible. Our employees have stepped up and demonstrated a lot of creativity and commitment. And just as an agency director, I'm very pleased to report that our workforce of about 300 lottery employees remains healthy. We have followed the lead of many leading private sector employers. The lottery will remain in this work from home posture at least until the end of this calendar year. And then we'll see where we are in regards to the public health situation. The next slide illustrates the impact of the pandemic on lottery sales. This graph provides a month-by-month comparison between last year and this year. The green bar is this year, the gray is last. You'll see that we started this calendar year in January and February just slightly behind where we were last year. Mid-March is when public awareness and concern about coronavirus first took hold. It's when business restrictions and shelter-in-place guidance took effect. We saw a sudden dramatic drop in lottery sales activity in March, which continued through much of April. But beginning in late April, we began to see a solid rebound in lottery retail sales. And that actually continued through the end of FY20 and in fact has continued into this new fiscal year. We believe that the retail rebound was triggered by a couple of factors. By late April, most retailers had retrofitted their stores, installing things like plexiglass at the counter, enforcing mask requirements, and posting appropriate signage about physical distancing. Consumers appear to have pretty quickly adapted to the public health guidance and to the new normal, and became more comfortable navigating public spaces and the business restrictions. It's also important to note that from March and continuing through July, the Virginia Lottery literally was the only game in town. Many retailers had unplugged their skill machines because they typically are stacked really close together in confined spaces. It's also significant that historical horse racing was offline from March through July, and other gaming options such as casino gaming in Maryland and other neighboring states also was shut down during that same period. Next slide. The strong turnaround that we began to see in late April and which continued through the end of the fiscal year allowed us to post strong fourth quarter and overall fiscal year results. For FY20, we exceeded our sales goal by 0.1%. We exceeded our revenue expectations for FY20 by 1.5%, which means that the handover in FY20 to the Lottery Proceeds Fund for K-12 programs totaled $595 million. Considering the competitive pressure that we faced for much of the year, historical horse racing, gray machines, the global health crisis, and that sharp impact on the overall economy, we were very pleased at what we consider to be solid performance for FY20. And again, that's thanks to hard work and a lot of adaptability by everybody on the lottery team. And we certainly appreciated the administration and the legislature's support as we navigated a pretty remarkable year. Next slide. As appropriators, you probably know this, but just a quick reminder of how each lottery dollar is spent. The state constitution requires that all lottery profits be directed towards K-12 public school programs. Our players now have contributed a combined $10 billion for public schools since 1999, which we are exceptionally proud of. But, more than 60% of lottery profits is returned to players in the form of prizes. Our 5,400 retail partners earn about 6% in commissions and bonuses and other incentives. The statute allows us to spend up to 10% on operations, but we have historically kept that at a very thrifty 5%. And that leaves the remaining 28% or so of every dollar in profit, which you then can appropriate for K-12 programs. The next slide features a graph that shows the trend of incremental growth in lottery proceeds over the past 5 fiscal years. A couple of notes. FY17 featured a pretty significant residual transfer due to a $1.5 billion Powerball jackpot in the prior year. FY19 also featured a significant residual transfer due to a $1.5 billion Mega Millions jackpot in the fall of 2018. FY20 dipped downward somewhat due to a couple of factors, a lack of jackpot rolls in those big multi-state games. There was a stretch of what we would call dry luck in the daily draw games, which is now rebalanced over time. And also, you'll recall that we were warning of the cumulative impact of skill machines, which over the course of last year were being placed in large numbers in the space where we conduct the bulk of our retail business. You'll also note on the right side of the chart that the budget enacted by the legislature last spring includes a $658 million revenue expectation for FY21. That revenue number presumed a $40 million lottery profit rebound from the elimination of skill machines, which, as you know, the ban has been delayed for at least 1 year, but the existing budget still includes the presumption that our sales would rebound because of the expected ban. So, we expect to fine tune the FY21 and 22 numbers. We're currently working, as Secretary Lane said, with Finance DPB on a revised sales and revenue forecast for the governor's December presentation to the money committees. Next slide. In response to the higher revenue goals and the more competitive gaming environment and the overall economic uncertainty, we are taking some steps to attempt to shrink that gap. Let me publicly again thank Senators Norment and Barker for their bipartisan co-sponsorship of the iLottery legislation in this year's session. Thanks to an incredible effort by our digital team, we were able to introduce online lottery into the marketplace on July 1st, the very first day that we were legally permitted to provide iLottery. We continue to believe that it will strengthen overall lottery sales by reaching consumers anywhere they are, anytime they want. Typically, it would have taken a year or more to launch an iLottery platform. We managed to get it done in less than 4 months. And that means it will provide several additional months of unanticipated revenue, which will help us fill that gap in the FY21 budget. It's too soon to set a baseline iLottery number. The product is still new, and consumer behavior is evolving due to the current circumstances. But I can tell you that we hit our first quarter expectations by week 4. The July iLottery launch was strong. August and September sales were even stronger. So we have high hopes that the earlier than expected introduction of iLottery will be a long-term performer for us. One other important factor to mention, it's important to note that since we launched iLottery, we also have seen significant growth in the sale of traditional lottery products at the retail counter. Scratch tickets, which is our bread and butter, they're moving at 8% over last year. The daily draw games, the pick 3, pick 4 games, which like scratch tickets are not available on iLottery, they are trending at 23% over last year. So the introduction of the online platform has not had a discernible impact on sales at the retail counter, which we certainly are very happy to see. Also, a new tool going forward. Our players have been asking for a Keno style game for several years now. Our board approved it last year. An anticipated April launch was delayed for obvious reasons. In August, we moved ahead with a soft launch that recognizes the current limits on retail and the restaurant business. Keno is a very popular product in every adjoining state. It's nearly a $290 million a year line of business in Maryland. Brings in $84 million a year in Kentucky, about $40 million in North Carolina. You know, we expect this to be a future performer for us once the economic uncertainty shakes out a little bit further. But we have introduced that into the market. We currently are seeing just over $1 million a week in Keno sales, with a higher than average payout for lottery products. We estimate annual revenue of less than $10 million in fiscal year 21. And finally, we're continuing to work to expand our reach at retail. We're adding self-serve vending machines at more than 100 Walmart stores. We're just beginning to introduce vending at CVS stores across Virginia. Customers really like the convenience of self-serve vending. Retailers really like the built-in inventory control features, which reduces somewhat the burden on their staff. So we continue to expect some incremental growth in traditional lottery, thanks to the expansion of self-serve vending. Next slide. Even as we talk about innovating lottery products and delivery platforms, I think it's also important to note that we also continue to be committed to the principles of responsible gaming, and this extends across all elements of our operations. We continue to be a strong partner with the Virginia Council on Problem Gambling. We fund their statewide hotline. The number for that hotline is posted on every lottery ticket and on all of our advertising. The Virginia Lottery is one of the first U.S. state lotteries to be certified for its responsible gaming efforts from the National Council on Problem Gaming. The new iLottery platform incorporates many strong guardrails for responsible play, many of them not available even with traditional lottery products at the counter. I would mention that there has been national attention given to the sports betting statute that we're now working to enact, and the Sports Bettors Bill of Rights and the player protections that the legislature built in to that legislation. And I'll also note that our team has now had several meetings with the Department of Behavioral Health, which is charged with standing up a new problem gambling function that was required by the legislature, both in the sports betting and in the casino gaming statutes. Next slide. This year will see perhaps the most dramatic expansion of the lottery's responsibilities since we were created 32 years ago. We certainly appreciate the legislature's confidence in our ability to build out a responsible regulatory infrastructure for sports betting and casino gaming. I'd like to give you just a brief update on the progress we've made in hitting the ambitious deadlines that were built into both of the expanded gaming bills. Next slide. Since the reconvened session in April, we have been moving aggressively to build the regulatory structure to support the oversight of expanded gaming. That effort has been made a bit more challenging due to the pandemic and the agency's remote work posture. But I'm pleased to report that we have been able to conduct some national recruitment and make some significant key hires for these new responsibilities. Most importantly, we created a new deputy director position for gaming compliance, and we're lucky enough to recruit the longtime CFO from the Maryland Lottery and Gaming Control Agency. More importantly, Gina Smith was the acting executive director when the Maryland Lottery added casino oversight to their regulatory responsibilities. But each of these additional management hires are now in place, and are actively working to recruit the additional personnel that will fully support the key regulatory responsibilities that are coming. We have built and launched an online licensing portal for sports betting applications and to collect the relevant information for all of the appropriate background vetting. We determined that we didn't have the time to go through a full procurement or to design our own system from scratch. We really liked an online portal that had been custom built by the Maryland Lottery and Casino Oversight Agency. So we struck an intergovernmental agreement with Maryland that will save us time and money by allowing us to use their source code to build and launch our own online portal to license both applicants for sports betting license and ultimately to handle the licensing for the literally thousands of individuals who will need a background check and a vet and a license in order to work on a casino floor in a year or two. Finally, as an agency director, I'm happy to report we won't have to lease additional workspace for the new regulatory functions. We worked with DGS to identify space within our existing footprint here at Main Street Center, up the street from the Pocahontas Building in the state capitol, to accommodate the new functions and the new employees. Next slide. As a non-lawyer, I'm not sure I fully appreciated the complexity involved in turning legislative language into regulatory language. A normal rulemaking process, as you know, typically takes considerable time, perhaps as much as 18 months. The General Assembly plainly recognized that the ordinary rulemaking process could not apply to expanded gaming if we wanted to get it off the ground in an expedited fashion. So we spent most of the summer turning about 9 pages of legislative language on sports betting into 70 pages of very specific regulation. Our initial draft regulations were posted for at least 30 days of public comment from stakeholders. Some of the regs were out for 60 days. We received hundreds of comments from about 50 stakeholders, including citizens, but also major sports betting operators, casino operators, the major sports leagues. That reaction and the interest from the industry so far indicates that most of them believe we've been transparent and accessible and reasonable in designing the rules around sports betting. Our board approved the initial regs on September 15th. That date was specified in the statute. We began accepting applications for sports betting licenses last week on October 15th, and the application window closes on October 31st. So we are very early into a 17-day application period. We will review the completed applications, conduct background and suitability checks on the applicants within 90 days. That's the time frame also specified in the statute. We expect that we're going to be in a strong position to issue the first licenses for online sports betting in Virginia early in 2021. Next slide. In mid-July, the lottery completed a preliminary review of the casino partners that were chosen by the cities of Bristol, Danville, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. You may recall that the casino legislation required that pre-certification by the lottery before each city could move forward to schedule a voter referendum this November. I want to provide 2 quick footnotes on pre-certification. The statute required each city to look at factors such as capital investment, potential economic impact, the experience of their preferred casino partner. The statute required the lottery to do a preliminary assessment of the financial viability of each of the city's preferred partners and to look at their casino partners' experience in operating gaming in a regulated environment. So the lottery completed pre-certification right out of the gate to give the cities time to go to their local circuit courts to get the referenda scheduled. Obviously, pre-certification by the lottery is not an endorsement of any of the 4 casino proposals. Pre-certification doesn't entitle anyone to a license. I want to be clear that there is a much more significant in-depth financial vet and background check that occurs later and that can take up to a year to complete. Another footnote before Senator McClellan points it out that your casino legislation also allowed the city of Richmond to be the 5th Virginia locality eligible to host a casino project. But as y'all probably know, Richmond is on a different timeline than the other 4 cities. So the statute did not require Richmond to submit a casino proposal or seek pre-certification or go to referendum at this time. Our legal team has started work now on the casino regulations with the goal of presenting them to the board in February. That's 106 days from now, but who's counting? This also is an ambitious timeline that is baked into the statute that we should have the initial regulations completed by April. We anticipate being on track to begin accepting the first casino license applications in late spring or early summer of next year. So in summary, Madam Chair, members of the committee, I have often compared this accelerated rulemaking process around expanded gaming to building the airplane while flying it. But I am pretty pleased to report that we are on track, that we are meeting all of the deadlines that are included in both the sports betting and the casino gaming statute. And the goal here, which I think we all share, is to create a legal vehicle for adults who enjoy this type of gaming, but to design a program that protects consumers, that provides some assurance that winning wagers will be paid and appropriately taxed, and that guards against criminal activity such as money laundering and such. I feel really confident that we are making considerable progress, that we're doing it in a transparent way, and that we are providing some clear and reasonable rules of the road. And with that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kevin. We put a lot of responsibilities on your shoulder during the last session, and it's really heartwarming to see how well you all are carrying them out. It's especially given the pandemic and all the problems that come with that. I think your agency, your 300-person team, has done a really impressive job.
Really appreciate that. Thank you, ma'am.
Are there any questions?
Yes, ma'am. Tommy.
Senator Dorman.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Kevin, I also echo what the chairman has said. I think that you and your team have done an extraordinary job under some accelerated circumstances, and I thank you for that. I have some questions probably in 3 different areas. Picking up on the last area that you were discussing, and that's the casino licensing. When it comes in, I appreciate that the pre-certification is not an assurance that a license will be issued. But as you and your team consider the issuance of a license, is it going to be any consideration given to the geographical proximity of casinos as how it may impact the financial viability of that operation?
I appreciate the question, Senator Norman.
I knew you would.
I'm, I'm not sure that the statute gives us that authority. Unlike other casino states, the statute basically identified the specific localities that were eligible and left it to the localities to choose a dancing partner, if you will. So the regulator isn't involved in either of those decisions other than to do the somewhat invasive financial and criminal background vet of the applicant following the submission of an application. The question about economic impact and local footprint was a consideration that was left to the eligible host cities to sort through.
Madam Chairman, if I may follow up on that question, please.
Senator Norman.
Thank you. As we're going into the 2021 session and looking at what you referred to as the early timeline, which is the spring or summer of 2021, do you think it would be appropriate, or from a policy standpoint, for the General Assembly to consider the geographical proximity as it may impact the economic viability? The last thing we want to do is go down this route and have a significant failure.
My initial, thank you for the question again, Senator. We are adapting to our new role as the regulator of expanded gaming activities. And in that regard, I would be happy to engage in conversations with you on that. But I feel like our new role is to implement what the legislature tells us to do, and not to be an advocate for the expanded gaming or any specific project being considered within it.
I appreciate, Madam Chairman, I appreciate very much your diplomatic answer, and I am also respectful that you are deferential, that the legislature in fact passes the laws which you do implement. But I thought I would at least tease you with that. Madam Chairman, another question, if I may, please.
Certainly.
Kevin, on slide 8, you made reference to the problem gaming situation. And I know that you work in conjunction with that group, but do you have any sense, is this more than just eyewash? Do you have any idea how many individuals have been worked with, and whether actually there has been any therapeutic intervention that helps people overcoming a proclivity they may have to gaming?
I know there will be, because both the casino and the sports betting legislation actually created a revenue stream to be directed to the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health to create programs specifically tailored to problem gaming. Over the past several years, we have been a lead partner with the Virginia Council sponsoring the hotline, which is an entry point to access local services. And we get monthly reports on the calls, where they're coming from, who's calling, what form of gaming they indicate they're having a problem with. I think the legislature's wisdom in actually designating a revenue stream for the Department of Behavioral Health will make a market improvement in what resources are available on the ground, even as Virginia is providing access to additional forms of gaming. So I think we're about to get much better data. In fact, some of that revenue is already coming in, I'm told, to behavioral health. I believe from skill games. I think there's a portion of their revenue as well.
Madam Chairman, a follow-up question, please.
Senator Norman.
Thank you, ma'am. The monthly reports that you get, are they proprietary or are they subject to dissemination to legislators?
Let me check and get back to you today on that. I'm not sure. We don't create it or produce it, and I want to be careful about obviously confidentiality issues with folks that are making the wise, if not brave, step of reaching out for help. So, Senator, that's a great question. I just want to be sure of my facts rather than winging it, but I'll get back to you today on that.
Madam Chairman, I appreciate your cautiousness on that, but if the state is putting money in it and we have seen the art of redacting certain disclosing information in other venues, it might be enlightening for us as legislators to know whether or not there really is any significant utilization of addressing problem gaming. So I look forward to hearing from you. And it doesn't have to be today, sir. Madam Chairman, the last area, if I could follow up with one more question, please.
Certainly.
I am, Kevin, I'm old enough to remember the public debate when the lottery was enacted and some of the confusion and obfuscation that came about actually from a gentleman that somehow I miraculously snuck up on and was able to beat in 1991. But we have come a long way from the lottery tickets that we originally contemplated and have gotten into a diversified gaming economy. And my question to you is that while we've gone from just lottery tickets that you could purchase at the convenience store to online, now going into Walmart, we're going into casinos, we've gone into horse racing, just the diversification from a policy standpoint, and I realize you're an implementer, is enough at this point, or do you think we need to consider expanding it into other type of gaming opportunities? And I say that recognizing the General Assembly has an insatiable appetite for money that they do not have to raise directly themselves.
That's an interesting question, Senator.
I'm an interesting guy today. You can tell I didn't go to court today, so I'm just very curious today.
I don't know. That is a question that is worthy of thought and reflection before I provide an answer. I will note this, that the unique, perhaps once in a generation impact of the public health emergency has prompted a push by the gaming industry for further expansion. For instance, the United States has about 1,000 casinos. All of them were dark for about a 3-month period, and they are only now beginning to come back online, most of them with pretty significant restrictions. I have been made aware that among the gaming industry nationally, there has been increased conversation about, for instance, online casino gaming, which is something that I'm not sure was contemplated at the time that we in Virginia authorized moving ahead on the up to 5 land-based casinos. I am aware nationally there is conversation among the gaming industry about alternate payment forms, up to and including items like Bitcoin. So there is the beginnings of a push nationally towards innovation, mostly in the digital space, that would have the net effect of an even further expansion beyond even the dramatic new place where Virginia finds itself today. A lot of these discussions have accelerated, I believe, because of the unique disruption that was caused by the coronavirus and the restrictions on that activity. So suffice it to say, there will always be an industry interest in pushing the envelope forward and using whatever opportunity or tools are available. Virginia as a Commonwealth is somewhat late to the conversation, but I believe, based on the leadership of those of you in the legislature and the administration, is moving forward in kind of a measured and responsible way. But I don't disagree with you that the conversation is going to continue to evolve, and the pressure to expand even further will perhaps come sooner rather than later. I hope that was responsive to your
Yes,
question.
sir. And I am aware of some of the national trends just from some readings I've done. But Kevin, thank you. And Madam Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to ask the questions.
Of course, of course. Does anyone else have questions? If not, thank you so much, Kevin. It was a really informative presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members. Appreciate it.
Next, we're going to hear from Peter Blake. He's going to be doing our final presentation of this morning, and he'll be speaking about SHEV and our higher education institutions.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to see you and to hear your conversations. I miss being with you, so I hope all of you are well. I'm going to step through just a couple of slides here and try to be responsive to some of the questions that Sarah and April had asked about. So we'll move to the next slide and I'll show the overview. And these are the 5 topics that I'll go through very quickly here. I don't want to prolong this any more than you want it to be prolonged, but we do want to touch on these 5 items. So next page, please. I spoke to you earlier, or to the subcommittee earlier in the year on tuition and fees. I just want to bring this back to the full committee and to show what colleges, universities did with their tuition for this fall. And so the top line, this is for the universities, the average increase of $112, that's 1.2%. Of the 15 four-year institutions, 10 of the universities had no increase in their E&G, their educational and general programs tuition. 10 out of the 15 had no increase. And so that nets then to the 1.2% increase. If you skip down on that far right-hand column 2 lines, so the total tuition and all mandatory fees, this includes your auxiliary fees, everything, all in cost other than room and board, the increase was 1.5%. That's the lowest increase in over 20 years. And I'll just make the note that our colleges, universities understand, and their boards understand their mission and their market very well, and made the decision early on to not have substantial tuition and fee increases. And they made these decisions back in March, right when the pandemic was taking off. And so I just want to give some credit and recognition to the good work of the boards to moderate tuition increases, the lowest for tuition and fees in over 20 years. Next slide. So a little bit about where we are, and you've been reading and have been hearing, I'm sure, from the students, your constituents, colleges, universities, reading in the news media, what's been going on. I say that they are substantially open, but materially different. All universities, public and private, have more online courses, some more than others. I think I heard earlier a conversation about the outdoor classrooms, and certainly a mild fall has enabled a lot of colleges, universities to hold outdoor classes. I was at Shenandoah University just last week, my first campus visit since March, and I spoke to a freshman seminar class, and it was held outdoors. You walk around Virginia Commonwealth University here in Richmond, and you'll see tents set up all around the library where outdoor classes are being held. So lots of outdoor learning experiences. It'll be interesting to see how that transitions when the weather turns much colder. As you know, there are fewer intercollegiate athletic activities going on at our colleges, universities. And then there's stepped up rigor around testing, contact tracing, the quarantines and isolation continues. But what I really want to leave with you is the notion that teaching and learning and research and service continue. So while what's happening at our colleges and universities this fall is materially different, the teaching and learning and research and service continue at a level that we should be pleased with. So finally, a mention about absorbing the budget shocks. I won't say that they're out of the woods, but with the CARES funding that Aubrey Lane had talked about and you're familiar with, the additional state funding that you approved last week, the restructured debt that the governor announced, other strategies, institutional savings strategies, they're absorbing these budget shocks here in the short term. We can talk about some potential longer term issues later on. Next slide. Did want to talk about early enrollment estimates. We'll get more detailed information, student level data by mid-November or so, but this is what we have in the aggregate. Across the system, enrollment is down about 1.3%. Back in the spring, many soothsayers were projecting that it could be down by as much as 20%. So we're down by about 1.3%. This is overall public and private, in-state, out-of-state, online and remote, or online and in person, down a little over 1%. At our 4-year public institutions, the undergraduate enrollment is basically level at 0.05%. Graduate enrollment is up just a little bit. Here's where I have a little concern. The first year enrollment, this is freshman, first year class, is down 10% among the 4-year public institutions. So that has a ripple effect, of course, over the period of time that the students are enrolled. So while overall enrollment is holding up, and the way these numbers shake out suggests that more students, continuing students, chose to come back than in the past. And that, so while you can have a first time enrollment down 10%, that your overall undergraduate enrollment is flat suggests that more students came back. We'll be able to do some further analysis on that later in the fall. But we do have a concern about the first year enrollment being down, and there's large variability. So at some institutions, the first year numbers are down by maybe as much as 18-20%. And at others, they're about level, maybe a little bit of an increase. So a lot of variation among the institutions. Some concern, though, about the first year enrollment being down by about 10%. Next page. A little more about the enrollment. We're seeing that students are staying closer to home. So our in-state enrollment is up. Out-of-state enrollment is down. And I would imagine that's what other states, institutions are seeing across the nation. We also observe, and don't know again the details, that students have other obligations, and they may be taking care of family, they may be health, they may be financial. So the part-time enrollment is up. Full-time enrollment is down. That will have an impact on how long it takes for students to complete their degree program. And so we will be following this very closely here as well over the next several months to see the impact of the shifts in enrollment. And finally, we have some early indicators on the impact of low-income and minority students, because some of the enrollment at minority serving and low-income serving institutions is lower across the system than at other institutions. So we don't know the details. We'll get the student-specific data later on in November, but this is an area of concern that we will be watching closely. Next page. So what we don't know yet, I did mention some differences in enrollment among the new students, the first-year students, as well as continuing students. We have some early indicators on change in enrollment by race and ethnicity and income and locality. Again, we'll know more later. We're concerned. We're not sure what the impact on dual enrollment with our high schools will be, just because of the disruption that's also going on in our high schools right now, as well as transfer from 2-year institutions to 4-year institutions. So we know a little bit, but we'll know a lot more later on in the year. Next slide, just a quick preview for spring, and we're getting some of these reports right now from the institutions. I hope to have a little optimism. We usually see some kind of melt between the fall semester and the spring semester. Hope is not necessarily a very powerful policy position, but I guess I'm hopeful that while some students chose to sit out in the fall semester, that they'll come back in the spring, and we'll maybe treat the spring semester as their first time in college in the same level of enthusiasm that they did in the fall. Don't know if that'll happen, but I'm hoping for a little less of a melt between the fall semester and the spring semester. I'll note that while remote learning, it'll continue to be a practical and prevalent practice. It's getting better. So last spring, the great pivot that occurred in March and April, where public colleges and universities converted over 32,000 classes to online in a very short period of time. And I imagine there were a lot of bumps in the road. Faculty and institutions have engaged in extensive development and training over the summer and into the fall. They're getting better at this. So my anticipation again in the spring is that while it'll still be prevalent, the online learning will be better and continue to improve. I'll also note that we're seeing early indications of some changed calendars for the spring. Continued concern about student travel back and forth between the campus and home, or maybe some other places like spring break. So many of the colleges, universities are canceling their spring break, and as a result, they're starting their semester a little bit later, and perhaps ending a little bit sooner. So there are some calendar adjustments as well that we will be seeing in the spring of 21. Let me step then quickly to the budget. If I may, the next slide. And, I feel badly putting up a slide to show how good the budget was that you approved last spring. And Madam Chair, I just remember your quotes in the paper and kind of the the real heartbreak that you conveyed and having to undo many of the things that you did in a very excellent budget last year. So over $380 million for higher education. And you can see in the bar chart how that breaks down in the budget, and you focused in the right areas: closing attainment gaps, addressing affordability, and providing services to students with the highest need. So that's what was coming out of the 20 session. So the next slide shows a little bit of what happened in the special session. So you were able to do some restorations, and that's what the top line is. The middle line is the amounts again that add back to actually 380 plus on the previous slide. So you were able to restore nearly 60% of the funding for the first year, FY21, through your actions last week. And then, of course, the second year, being appropriately cautious, given all the admonitions that you heard earlier and that from Secretary Lane and that you know well, you restored considerably less for the second year. So about 26% of the original. So stepping forward, and this is, I'll wrap up here and then be happy to engage in any conversation. The next slide shows where the council is, given all the framework that we talked about, where the council, Chev, will be meeting next week, and we're presenting some priorities for if there is any additional money. And of course, I'm cognizant of the potential of budget reductions and the structural imbalance that potentially we're facing in the second year of the biennium. But should you have additional appropriations, then the council would recommend in these general priorities. So priority one is, again, holding the vulnerable students harmless by maintaining financial aid at the FY21 level. So level funding of financial aid, as well as increasing outreach to potential students to avoid and help narrow some of the equity gaps. This is a small amount. It's about $21 million for the priority one. And so again, we're trying to be very mindful of the constraints that we know the Commonwealth will be facing in January. Priority two steps up and builds upon what you had in the first priority. And again, we go back to particularly the financial aid appropriations that you approved last year were the largest in the state's history. and to get back to that level would be so meaningful for so many Virginians who are feeling the pinch and the impact of the recession and the higher college costs. So anything you can do in priority 2 to fully fund that financial aid recommendation and a few related items included in here is the G3, the Free Community College Initiative as well. So that second priority totals about $63 million. The third priority, Madam Chair, members, is would be the full restoration back to what you had approved in the 20 session. So we tried not to introduce any, if maybe 1 or 2 new items, but did want to give some recommendations on priorities to restore what was an excellent budget coming out of 2020. The priority 3 adds yet another $53 million. So that adds up to about $140 million, gives you some options and some prioritization given the funds available come January and looking at the revenues that you have before you. So, Madam Chair, I'll wrap up there. I touched very quickly on 5 broad topics. I'd be happy to take any questions or discuss further any of the items that I've presented.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Is that Senator Peterson?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
If I might ask a question. Peter, thank you again for your presentation. I give you credit for seeing the glass as being half full, not half empty. But I do have to ask you, if you're counting basically the number of students that are in the higher education system, whether they're online or on campus. And so if we have a major university that, for example, sends all their students home, so they're learning from their homes as opposed to being on the campus, there's no net loss. I mean, that's all the same number of kids that are showing up in the system. But I think we can all agree, just as we had this conversation with K-12, if somebody's sitting at a computer in their parents' basement, that's a different experience than if they're in a classroom on a college campus. And it's not of the same value and frankly does not necessarily deserve the same state funding. And so my question to you is, at this point, how many of our students are actually in classes? How many are living on campus, and what percentage of them are simply at home taking remote classes that they could take through any number of online vendors?
Yeah, Senator Peterson, Madam Chair, I appreciate the question. I don't have the exact numbers to tell you that. As you may know, every university brought students to campus, except for one of the publics, and that was Virginia State University. and of course, James Madison had the situation with local health departments and so forth, and sent students home. Of course, those students now back are on campus. And Virginia State University will be bringing students back on campus in the spring. Even as students are on campus, many of them are taking classes remotely. So at some universities, over half the classes are remote, even for students who are on campus. Particularly at some of the smaller institutions, they have much more in-person class activities. They have the space, they have the small student-faculty ratios already. They're able to do some things perhaps that some of the larger universities are unable to do. So I don't know, Senator Peterson, how many students, but there's a substantial number, even as they are on campus, who are taking classes remotely. They are having other experiences that do contribute to learning by being on campus, so I wouldn't discount it entirely. And then I'll just go back and say that the online instruction that is occurring now is vastly better than it was last spring. So I'll pause there.
Let me just ask one follow-up, and I appreciate that. And look, I'm not oblivious to the fact that these are unique circumstances, and the college is doing the best they can. My follow-up is basically there were a number of students, and again, this isn't captured in the data, who took remote classes. They enrolled for a semester, but they're living at home. They did not pay the room and board. And so I'd be interested to know what our dorm population is, or even what the population is in the communities that normally would absorb these student populations when you have students that would normally be living in Charlottesville or Blacksburg or Fairfax City, and instead they're home and they're taking the classes remotely. I just think that's a critical piece of the puzzle here. And we'll need to know that by January at least.
Thank you, Senator. We will pursue those questions.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Janet.
Any further questions?
Madam Chairman?
I believe that's Senator Norman.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I applaud Senator who just asked these questions, but if I may, Peter, following up, the decline in first year enrollment, which institution was most dramatically impacted as opposed to it being amortized over all of the public institution? Who was most dramatically impacted?
Okay, Senator Norman, Madam Chair, I'm just looking at some numbers right now. Virginia Tech was down about 1,000 students in first year students compared to last year. George Mason, about 640. Virginia Commonwealth, about 719. In terms of percentages, Virginia State was down about 25%. Radford down about 19%. So that's a quick hit, Senator, on what we've seen.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And also as to, is there any correlation between the first year enrollment and those who did not return?
Well, Senator Norman, Madam Chair, the fact that overall enrollment was about level suggests, and that first time enrollment was down 10%, suggests that more students who were continuing students came back than previously. I can't answer that definitively until we get the student specific data, which we'll get in mid-November, but that's the early indicator.
Madam Chairman, I thank you. The other question is a little argumentative, and I will offer that as a preface, because for a number of years, I have suggested that SHEV and the legislature needs to impose a greater discipline on higher education. And in light of what is going on, do you see that the financial implications to higher education, which are going to continue far beyond 20 and 21, do you think this is an opportunity to impose some discipline on higher education as far as their insatiable appetite to expand their curriculums and their amenities to remain competitive against one another?
Thank you, Senator, for that argumentative question. I would expect no less. A couple of things. I mean, the institutions are well aware of the financial challenges that they're facing and are taking steps right now to adjust how they do their operations. So I'll just preface with that. I do think the time is appropriate to take a look, and there's a variety of factors, not just COVID, but COVID might have accelerated them, to take a look and for the legislature, SHEV institutions to work together on exactly what you just said. We see over the next 10 years or so, we know what the high school enrollment numbers are over the next 10 years or so, and we see those trends. We can anticipate the impact on enrollment and the demand for students, both in Virginia as well as across the nation. So there's the demographic changes. There is a need for greater levels of more sophisticated education, frankly, in order to be competitive in the workplace. So more people need education at a time when the demography suggests that fewer might enroll. And then third, you have the financial constraints, both on the student as well as on the Commonwealth. And so there is a convergence, and now being made more complex by COVID, of a lot of forces that are going to drive some different kinds of behavior by individual institutions, and then how we as a state coordinate that work. So The short answer to your question, Senator, is yes. I think the time is right for that kind of conversation. We've been having some of that among what we call the Op6 group, which includes your staff and others. So I would look forward to having more of those kinds of conversations with you and others.
Madam Chairman, last comment, if I may, please.
Senator Norman.
One of the concerns that I've had in recent years is the request of some of our public colleges and universities to continue to increase their student enrollment with a mix of in-state students and out-of-state students, with the out-of-states purportedly carrying 100% of the cost. A concern that I have had is some of our four-year institutions in increasing their incoming student population have had a trickle-down effect, and students that previously may not have been admitted to one of these four-year institutions and would have gone to another four-year institution is putting enormous fiscal pressure on them. And I am very concerned about some of the schools like Radford, Longwood, Mary Washington, and I just offer them by way of example. And what can we do to try to protect the financial viability of those schools as some of the other schools keep increasing their student population, which means they have to dip down deeper in their applicant pool?
Senator Norman, Madam Chair, that question certainly could be a feature of what we just talked about. So within some sort of statewide coordinated planning, that might be some questions that we would want to address. You hear a lot about that. I'm not sure, and some of it is data driven and some of it is not. So I guess I'd want to hold judgment on the direct impact of what you described. I think there is some evidence of it, but it might not be as dramatic as perhaps we might have concluded from some anecdotes. So I'll throw that little bit of caution into that conversation as well. I tell you, all of our schools are very competitive. They're all able to recruit and retain students. They all have different strategies for making sure that they offer a high quality education to as many students who are able to attend within the mission of their institution. So I'll just add to your comment that they're all very competitive and able to do well in this market.
Madam Chairman, last comment.
Senator Norman.
Consistent with my concern out of discipline, I was an English history major, Peter, so I don't get stuff. And I don't buy the argument that maybe demographically and data driven, it's not having the impact. If the University of Virginia decides they're going to accept 1,000 more students than they did the previous year, those 1,000 students are coming out of their existing applicant pool, and those students would have been going somewhere else. And you don't need a lot of specific data to figure that out commonsensically. So I'll look very much to hearing a follow-up from you, Peter, and thanks for all you do.
Good.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Are there any further questions? If not, thank you, Peter. Higher ed has been hit harder than most state agencies, and it's much more complex than most. And I really appreciate your leadership and guidance through this.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to be with you today.
You're welcome. That completes our agenda. I did want to tell members of the committee, as well as the whole Senate, that we will be having a Senate Finance Retreat again this year. It will be on November 19th in Richmond, I believe at the Science Museum again. But it is going to be somewhat compressed compared to other years, just sort of out of deference for all of the time all of the senators have had to be away from their usual routines. So you will be getting details about that in several days from Senate Finance staff. Is there any other business? If not, the committee will rise.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet.